And so that's part of our wheelhouse as well. Let me give you just a little bit of background information about myself, and I do this primarily because it's, I think, relates to the topic. I spent my entire career in the nonprofit sector, and I define that broadly. For 33 years, I worked in higher education in a variety of administrative positions. I also taught part-time. For the last 10 years of that career, I was a vice president at Millersville University here in Lancaster. And though a lot of people don't think of education as part of the nonprofit sector, in fact, it is. And then for 12 years, after I left Millersville, for 12 years, I served as the president of Tabor Community Services. It's now known as Tenfold. It's a social service provider based here in Lancaster, a fairly large organization. When I was there, we had 55, 60 employees, about a $5 million annual operating budget, and served about 5,000 families here in Lancaster. I think those numbers have grown somewhat since Tabor merged with another nonprofit and took on a new name. I tell you all this because I tried to, as I prepared for this presentation, I tried to count up the number of times I was involved in or led strategic planning processes throughout my career, and I honestly could not remember all of them. Now, it was a 45-year career, but I had that experience many times throughout my career. And one of the things I remember about that experience, or those experiences, is that what often happened, didn't happen all the time, but what often happened was then within about a year, the strategic plan into which people had invested a great deal of time, careful thought, and the best of intentions, but within a year or so, the strategic plan had fallen by the wayside. It was put in a folder in a filing cabinet or on a shelf somewhere, and there wasn't a return focus to it on a regular basis. And so within a year or so, we would sometimes find ourselves asking this question: whatever happened to our strategic plan? And we'd get it out and smile at some of what was in there, because we would think, oh, well, that was naive to think we could do that. Or, oh, yeah, that was a good idea. I wonder why we didn't follow up on it. Let me ask, have any of you ever had that experience with the nonprofits with which you have been associated? Speak up, everyone, anyone.
Hi, this is Brandon. I'm involved in 2 volunteer fire companies, and absolutely it's happened where we had ideas and it just never fell into fruition or got forgot about after small efforts were made. So I can totally relate with that.
Anyone else? Well, if you have had that experience, I can tell you it's not uncommon. I think there are a variety of reasons for that happens when it does. You have to make a very concerted effort to keep the plan, keep focus on it, and not allow it to be set aside and eventually forgotten. So you have to be very deliberate about that. It may be sometimes that there are unrealistic goals in the plan. Again, They're adopted with the best of intentions, even careful thought, but in fact, they're not very realistic. I know that, and I knew this from my own experience, it is easy to be overwhelmed with the day-to-day demands of working at and being responsible for a nonprofit. And so it's not easy to carve out the time to think longer term. And so what I jokingly refer to as the tyranny of day-to-day demands can certainly take your time away from long-range planning. You can have too many goals. You can be really ambitious during the strategic planning process. And it's easy to establish lots of goals, but that you can have too many, and then it's just not realistic to think that you can focus and implement all of them. You may adopt plans or goals for a strategic plan, but there isn't sufficient money or time or staff to implement them. So that can certainly contribute to their falling by the wayside. Maybe you have adopted some plans that don't really fit very well with your mission and your vision. And so that, again, can contribute to their being pushed off to the wayside. And finally, if you work in an organization that is larger, what often happens is that there can be units within a larger organization, but they're loosely coupled. In other words, they're not really very tightly connected to other parts of the organization that they can operate independently. And they have their own agendas and so forth. And so it can be quite a challenge to focus on the areas in which those individual units can work cooperatively in a larger organization. Now, in spite of all of these things that make strategic planning and implementation fraught sometimes with problems and weaknesses, I argue that planning is still worthwhile, that any organization that simply works in place and doesn't think about the future and how it may need to adjust and change and take new initiatives runs the risk of letting competitive organizations pass them by. And within the nonprofit sector, I tend to think that every other organization is a competitor, even though they may have very different missions. We are all competing in the same arena for funding and support. And so if you kind of let things pass you by, you can find yourself in a few years really behind the curve. And so I think strategic planning really is a worthwhile thing to do. It's very important. The environment can change too. Things can happen in the environment external to your organization that have a big effect on you. And if you're not trying to figure out how to adjust to those changes, again, you can fall by the wayside. So I'm going to walk you through here today a process that is for strategic planning for nonprofits, and it's really designed to try to not only get you to think forward, but also to work through this in a way that the end result is a plan that is not forgotten, it's not put into a filing cabinet or on a shelf somewhere, but one is that it gets ongoing attention and is achievable. One suggestion, by the way, I would make right off the bat is that when you do strategic planning, I would, if possible, try to do that in a setting away from where you are normally working. One, you'll be distracted if you're in the work site, or you can be, by things that are happening. And two, it's also helpful sometimes to get your mind off the day-to-day, focused on a longer term. And it's easier to do that if you're in a setting that is not centered in the workplace. So by all means, if you do that, If you can, by the way, for a morning or an afternoon or even a day, I would encourage you to do that. Now, I've listed on the next page, or the beginning of the next page, Steve, if you could move us down there. We've talked about why things fall by the wayside. And on the next, little further down, I've begun to list some questions there. And we'll walk through these. These are steps that I'm suggesting that you can follow in the strategic planning process for your nonprofit. I always suggest that begin with, well, who are you and what do you do? What do you hope to accomplish? Where do you want to be as an organization in 5 years? Now, that may seem very elementary, and it is, but it's important to remain connected to your mission, to your vision for the future, what your central purpose is, what you're trying to accomplish, to get focused on what kind of dreams you have for your organization in the future. It's easy to get sidetracked with some other, perhaps in the long run, less important and significant issues, but one that nevertheless can be compelling at the time you're doing planning. And but you really want to keep focus on who you are and what you want to accomplish and what you are able to accomplish. So I would always start with the mission and the vision. As far as sometimes people have trouble distinguishing between both. In terms of vision, there's kind of two aspects to that. Where do you want to be as an organization in the future? What do you aspire to be? And on those discussions and questions, I think it's okay to think further out, 5, even 10 years. You'll see later on when we talk about timelines, I generally am a proponent of strategic plans that do not have any more than a 3-year timeline, because it's so difficult to anticipate what can happen over a period of more than 3 years. It can be difficult to anticipate what can happen next year. But in terms of a vision long term, I think it's appropriate to think long term. Where would you like to be as an organization? For example, I happen to be on the board of an arts organization. And long term, we would really like to have our own facility. We do not have our own facility today, and so we have to lease space. But there's no question that as an organization, we would find great advantage in having our own space. But acquiring that would require a lot of money, and we're not in a position to launch a capital campaign for that purpose. But as far as our vision as an organization, yes, ultimately we'd like to be in our own space for, I think, legitimate and very good reasons. And so that can be part of your vision, and you can keep your eye on that. That doesn't mean that you immediately drop everything else and focus on that particular long-term goal. But nevertheless, it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing to think about with vision statements is to ask yourself, well, what difference do we want to make? How will things be different if we realize our vision? And that can also lead to longer term kind of discussions. Now, as far as the mission really answers the question, well, how do you propose to realize your vision? What do you do? What purpose and role do you play as an organization? So I always think it's worthwhile to spend some time on vision and mission at the beginning of the planning process. Again, it may seem elementary and obvious, and in many cases it will be, and that's okay. You don't have to devote the whole retreat to it. But sometimes some thoughtful discussion about that can sharpen your thinking about where you want to be, where you want to go, and who you are. Now, the next step is well, how do we assess ourselves today, where we are today as an organization? Now, you'll see in those 4 questions there, those are the SWOT analysis questions. I'm sure many, if all of, not perhaps all of you, are familiar with that term. And it refers to taking a look at your strengths as an organization, your weaknesses, opportunities that you may have, and threats that may be out there for your organization. It's a it's a useful model, very commonly used both in the for-profit and the nonprofit sector. Some comments about using the SWOT analysis. Be rigorous. Get input from others outside of your organization in assessing your strengths and your weaknesses. It is easy when you have a primary mission that you have had for a long time. It's easy to say, oh, well, that's our strength. We're good at that. But ask other people, do you think we're as good as we think we are at fulfilling our mission? Is that really our strength? You don't want to overlook other strengths that you may have, and nor do you want to overestimate or place too high on the scale your strength in fulfilling your mission or strengths. There may be some parts of that that are worth attention and focus for improvement. I would be comprehensive as you work through these questions too. Look at the purpose of your organization. What service do you provide, or what product do you produce? And look at areas of the organization such as staffing or finances or operations, how you function, marketing. Nonprofits generally have to work at attracting resources, attracting attention, making friends. I always say that a nonprofit can't have too many friends. So as you assess strengths and weaknesses and opportunities, be sure to cover all of those different aspects of your organization. Opportunities are trends that can play to your strengths, opportunities that exist outside of your organization. But there may be sometimes opportunities to address what you have identified as weaknesses. So keep an eye out for what's going on around you. And similarly with the threats, you have to understand trends that are outside, external to your organization, market shifts, new demands, declining demands, etc. All of which, or any of which, could impact your organization very, very significantly. And so you have to think broadly about those at these kinds of planning sessions. It's always good to have a whiteboard or newsprint that can be posted on walls and get people to really brainstorm and think broadly. Now, after you've done this SWOT analysis, the third step, and Steve, if you could move us up to the third and fourth questions. The first of the third, rather, would be ask, given the information you have gathered through your SWOT analysis, ask yourselves, well, what are the biggest issues for us in the next 3 years? And again, I recommend a timeline not to exceed 3 years. Just so much can happen the further you go out, and you increase the risk of having plans that become irrelevant or off the mark if you go out too far. So I wouldn't, personally, I recommend the 3-year timeline, not more than that. But what are going to be the biggest issues you face as an organization in the next 3 years, particularly given the information you've gathered through the SWOT analysis? What are the most consequential issues? do you face a significant change in funding patterns for your organization? And as you do this, I wouldn't take the time at this point in your discussion to discuss every issue, but rather brainstorm and get them listed. And after you've done that, then take the time to step back and say, okay, of these 6 or 7 things that we have identified, if you have that many, what are the most important? Prioritize them. But at this stage of the planning process, you're not setting goals yet, so you don't need to. We'll come to that later. Don't try to turn every issue into a goal yet, but identify the ones that seem to be the biggest ones for you. I can remember when I was at Tabor and we would do this exercise, funding patterns were often on the list of opportunities and threats. And then we would talk about, well, okay, how do we seize those opportunities, or how do we prevent the potential threat there to us? And sometimes these opportunities and threats can change. I can remember I was at Tabor during the time of the Great Recession. Some of you may remember back in 2007 and 8 and 9, the Great Recession and all the economic turmoil. That was the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression. And it was a very disturbing time. That's putting a polite word on it. There were nights when I would toss and turn worrying about how this was going to affect Tabor. I would think about donors not being able to give us as much money as they had, for example, foundations not having as much funding, government cuts, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the surprising things that came out of that was that there were new opportunities for funding for what we did. One of the big parts of Tabor's mission, still is, as Tenfold, was to help people with housing challenges, working with everything from homelessness to eviction prevention, to helping people find housing, helping people plan for purchasing their first home, all the things, sort of soup to nuts in terms of housing. And as a result of the Great Recession, the federal government made a lot of new money, grant money available, contract money, to deal with particularly homelessness and eviction prevention. So we had new opportunities for funding at a time when we were worried that we were going to lose a lot of funding. And so that's an example of how these things can change. But you need to keep abreast of what's happening and pay attention, because those opportunities, those threats can really impact your organization for better and sometimes for worse. Okay, then the next step, so to speak, after you've identified these biggest issues, I like to return to the mission and the vision statements, what you discussed earlier on the retreat, and ask yourselves the question, well, we've just talked a lot about what's happening and how we assess ourselves as an organization, et cetera. And given all that information, do we want to take a second look at who we are as an organization and what our dreams are? Is it appropriate to make any adjustments to the mission and the vision? Now, I would always urge people to choose very carefully here. And particularly if you think about changing your mission or adding new programs that take you in a different direction. I'm not saying that that's always a bad idea. In some cases, it can be a very strategic choice that pays off. But you do have to ask yourself, well, if we're going to provide new services, for example, of some kind, do we have the knowledge to do that? Or what will it take for us to acquire the knowledge and the information we'll need to do that? Do we have staffing? And if not, what will it cost us to get new staffing? What will new programs cost? What will be the opportunities for funding? It's nice to think, well, you know, it would be really cool if we did this or that. But if you haven't really looked carefully at these questions of, do you know enough about that new area to try to launch new services, or do you have staffing, and do you have the resources? And if you don't, how will you acquire them? If you don't address those questions, you can really get down into a rabbit hole that really isn't very productive. And one cautionary note, you've probably heard the expression, don't just chase money. You will hear about funding opportunities from time to time that would take you in a somewhat different direction. And you want to be careful about just saying, oh, well, there's some funding, so let's go after it. And we'll do that, perhaps in addition to or instead of what we have been doing. You want to be careful there that you're making those choices carefully, and that you're going to be able to follow through, and that your organization and the people you serve will benefit. Any questions or comments so far about what I've covered here? Okay, well, I'm going to keep moving through this. Steve, if you could move us up to 5 or down to 5 and 6. Okay. After you've gone through this identification of the most important issues, and you've taken a second look at your mission and your vision, and by the way, if after looking at your mission vision a second time, and you say, no, we don't really see any reason, it doesn't make sense for us to try to change those, then that's fine. Just move on with your planning. You don't have to make any changes there. Well, given all that information that you've kind of collected through your discussion and brainstorming and so forth, the next step would be to identify 4 or 5 most important priorities for you for the next 3 years as an organization. And I would say a maximum of 5 for strategic planning. More than that, you're going to spread yourself too thin, and again increase the danger of your plan falling by the wayside. I think of an ideal number as 3 to 4. More than 5, again, I think you're asking for spreading yourself too thin. But what are the most important priorities for you as an organization? And sometimes this can require you to make some choices that perhaps you might want to do 6 or 7. But again, if you try to do too many things at once, spread yourself too thin, you run the risk of not accomplishing any of them, or not accomplishing as much as you would had you been more focused on a more limited number. But try to identify what are the most consequential things for us as an organization. What will make the biggest difference for us as an organization and for the people, the cause, whatever it is that we serve, to focus on. And again, be prepared to spend some time on that. Allow for discussion among your staff, among your board members. Get a lot of opinion. Certainly what will improve the chances of effective implementation of a strategic plan is that if there is buy-in from across the organization. It also can pay too to involve others in your planning process. I mentioned getting some outside input on assessing your strengths, but you may have others outside of your organization who are knowledgeable enough and interested enough in what you do that they'll have helpful contributions to make to these kinds of discussions. But you ultimately want to have buy-in, ideally, and so take the time to get that by having a really thorough kind of discussion. The next step, what is the best way to set goals and objectives for your priorities that you have identified? And here, let me talk for a moment. I think I mentioned one of the the weaknesses sometimes in strategic plans is that you can have something, you can have a list of really impressive goals and say, wow, that'd be terrific if we can accomplish that. But there are not sufficient plans and measures in place to implement those steps. And one of the ways in which you can fall down at this stage of the planning process is to have goals that sound general. They sound good, but they're not very well defined. They're not specific. They're not measurable. You don't know when and if you have really achieved them. They may not be realistic. For example, you may set goals that upon closer scrutiny are just not achievable. And so I recommend using, and some of you will be familiar with this template known as SMART goals, SMART. SMART stands for, first of all, goal statements should be specific. They ought to be detailed enough so that you know what you're talking about and other people do. And it allows you to know and focus your attentions more. So you want to be specific in setting goals. For example, a very broad, suppose an organization through its planning process says, well, we need to become more diverse. Now, today, that's a very worthy kind of goal. But what does that really mean? It begs for more definition. Well, does that mean our staff is more diverse, or the people we serve are more diverse? So you really need to be more specific. A SMART goal is also measurable. You will be able to know whether or not you have achieved it because there are tangible and specific enough kinds of things in it that can be measured. So if your SMART goal is to have your staff become more diverse, well, you'll be able to measure you in a year or 2 or 3. Has your staff become more diverse or not? SMART goals are achievable. It's tempting during the planning process to dream big, and you want to do that, and to be idealistic. And you certainly want to be those things too. But you don't want to set up goals that are simply not achievable, that are not realistic for you as an organization at the time you set them, because the odds are that you won't achieve them. And not only will you not achieve them, but that can be discouraging to say, well, we're going to do this and not achieve it, not be able to do it, because then you can be discouraged. Some people will be defeatist about that. Well, we tried to do that, but nothing happened, or we weren't able to do it, and be disheartened by that. So you want to be careful to set achievable goals for yourself. Don't be unrealistic. Be relevant with the goals that you establish. They really ought to be pertinent to your organization and the people you serve. You don't want to get too far afield from your mission and your vision, because when they are, if you set goals that are somewhat irrelevant to all of that, there won't be attention and incentive to remain focused on them over a period of time. They'll fall by the wayside. And then finally, the T in SMART can stand for time bound. I am a proponent in setting goals of setting not only timelines, but what you want to do sometimes, after you've set goals using this format, you may want to establish objectives, which I use that term to indicate perhaps a lower level target that allows you to move toward achieving your goal. As an example, if you want to become have a more diverse staff, or you want to serve a more diverse population. You can set goals, and you should, using this format that I'm suggesting. But it can also be helpful then to say, well, these are our goals. This is our goal for the next 3 years. But establish some targets to be achieved after 1 year, and after 2 years, and after 3 years. And I like to label those objectives just because that can connote a little more specific, tangible step. But steps along the way that ultimately, if achieved, ultimately allow you to achieve your goal. Now, the next question, I think it's actually the last question in this process I'm outlining for you, is how are you going to keep focused on your strategic goals and your objectives? How are you going to monitor progress? How do you avoid this plan being set aside and within a year forgotten, so that you actually have to get it out and to remind yourselves what it contained in the first place? Well, some practices that I have found helpful are to work into your regular kinds of processes, staff meetings, board meetings, communications to your supporters. Work into all of those processes updates on your strategic plan. How are you doing? You need to tell people, and that increases the odds that you'll hold yourselves accountable. Tell people what you intend to do, and then regularly build into your reports to them, well, how are you doing? I've been on a board for the last several years. We've had, we called strategic initiatives, and I served as chair for a couple of years. And so I said, let's put these strategic initiatives on every agenda for every board meeting we have. And there were, I think, 4 or 5. And so we literally typed all of them put it right into the agenda, and then said, what kind of updates do we have for these? And it put people on the spot, reminded them, oh, okay, well, board meeting's coming up, or a staff meeting's coming up, and I see I'm on the agenda to give an update on this particular goal or objective. And so that's a way of keeping focus on it. Build a review of your progress into the processes, your regular kind of processes that you have as an organization. And again, I would add to include progress on these things in communications that you send to supporters, newsletters, that sort of thing. The other thing I always recommend is that don't wait until the 3-year period has passed to sort of assess how you've done. I would not only have these regular reports, but at the end of each year of the 3-year period, I would take the time to say, all right, let's pause here and let's see how we're doing in achieving these goals and objectives that we established for ourselves. What you may find is that, well, we've done pretty well with this one, but not so good with that one. And for the ones where you haven't achieved what you set out to, say, well, why? What happened? Are there reasons for this? Was it lack of attention? Was it a change in funding patterns? Whatever might have been the reasons. Not all of them point to a lack of discipline. Sometimes other things can happen outside of the organization that can cause that to happen. But do that at least once a year in a comprehensive way for the entire plan, and make adjustments. Don't be afraid to change things. Well, back a year ago, we set this goal, but some things have happened along the way. And so maybe we need to modify it a bit, adjust it. Don't be afraid to do that. And then return your focus to trying to achieve the readjusted goal or the revised goal. But I think if you follow those practices, that helps to keep your focus on your plans on an ongoing basis, so that they're not forgotten and set aside. Okay, that wraps up the information that I wanted to share with you. And I am happy to respond to questions, comments anyone has to make about all this. If you think I've left something out that's important that you want to add, please do that. Anyone?
Hi, my name is Amanda. I have a question for you. I'm kind of on the other side of, strategic planning where I am launching a new nonprofit with my husband, and we are creating a strategic plan. Do you have any recommendations, or suggestions on how to start off on a good foot?
Well, you don't have, Amanda, a history to examine,
Right.
as implied or suggested here in this process. But that doesn't mean, though, that you shouldn't be rigorous about thinking about your mission and your vision. And you need to be rigorous in your thinking and then get other people involved. When you launch a new nonprofit, I know it's a challenge. You're required by the IRS to establish a board, but use that opportunity as more than, well, okay, it says we have to have a board, and so I'll get this person and that person just so we can say we fulfilled that obligation. And I smile. I've had some SCORE clients, nonprofit clients, and when I ask them about who's on their board, and they'll say, well, my neighbor and my brother, my sister, and you can tell that, well, I've asked them because I figured I could persuade them to serve on the board, not so much because they're really all that interested in what I'm trying to do, but I've got to tell the IRS and give them the names of people. So carefully choose these people at the outset who may be able to have something to contribute. They're going to be interested in what you're doing, and get their input. And then as you move through that process, go through the exercise of, well, all right, what are the most important things that we need to focus on here on at the start? As a nonprofit just getting launched, well, where is your funding going to come from? What kind of resources are you going to need in order to accomplish what you hope to accomplish? And where will those resources come from? How will we know if we're making any progress? Ask yourselves those questions, because while this process I've outlined is designed more specifically, I think, for an existing organization, I think those questions lend themselves to initial planning. I don't know if that's helpful to you or not. I hope it is. Steve, could you move me down a little bit to these questions that we had in front of us? Amanda, when thinking about your mission, what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, is anyone else trying to do it? Because they are potential competitors. And is there a need for you to try to do something that somebody else is already doing? Now, there may well be, but there's a lot of duplication in the nonprofit sector. Nationally, there's about 1.5 million nonprofits registered with the IRS. And within Lancaster County, there's over 500. And I know there's duplication. The donors will often say, you nonprofits, some of you need to merge with each other, because I've got 3 of you coming at me asking me for money, and you're all doing, from what I can see, kind of the same thing. I'm not trying to talk you out of your idea, but ask yourselves that question. And then as far as assessing, what strengths do you bring to the table? And what weaknesses do you have as a startup? And how are you going to address those? What is your plan to address those? Are there opportunities for us as a startup? Are we doing something that's so different from what anybody else is doing that there may be some people or organizations that really want to support us? And go through, ask yourself those kinds of questions. Does that help at all, Amanda?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that, those
Sure.
thoughts that you have there. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. I have if you want to send to me an email, and my email is listed at the top of this presentation. I have a business plan template that I developed for nonprofits, and I'd be glad to send it to you. It's a series of questions that I think anyone starting a nonprofit from the beginning needs to ask, and the answers to that will help guide them as they move through that process. And I'd be glad to. In SCORE, we talk a lot about the necessity of businesses having business plans, and the same is true of nonprofits, especially startups. I'd be happy to send that template to you.
Yes, actually, that would be great. I will send you an email later today
Yeah,
to
yeah,
request
and
that.
I'll send it. In fact, I just sent it to somebody yesterday. I find the frequent use of it is helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Sure. Other questions or comments from anybody else?
Hi, Bob. This is Barbie Ellsworth. I just had a question on the strategic initiative for monitoring. Do you recommend appointing a specific person for each of the initiatives to own the initiative?
That can help. Barb, did you say Barb is your name?
Yes, Barbara. Mm-hmm.
That can help, yes. If it's not clear who's responsible for what steps, then yeah, you can easily find yourself in the situation saying, well, suppose you're the executive director or you're the board chair. Well, where are you with that? Well, nobody speaks up because no one person was delegated the responsibility for taking the lead on that particular goal or objective. So I think that's helpful. Yes, that's useful. Sometimes it can be board members, sometimes it can be staff, sometimes it can be combinations of the two.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Other questions or comments? Okay, well, I hope not too many of you dropped off or fell asleep. With these webinars, it's always really hard to know whether or not you're getting through. But anyway, I hope this has been of some help to at least some of you. Again, you've got my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out if you want to follow up on any of this with me. I'd be glad to help. Thanks, Steve, for serving as host today. And if there are no other questions or comments, I think we can sign off.
Thank you, Bob. And I want to let you know that everybody who signed on by noon was still online at 12:52. So no one left. In fact, we gained one person. I want to thank everybody and let you know that the next session will be on May the 17th, and it will cover online selling platforms. And the link, the registration link will be available in the next week or two. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, thank you.